humanitarians, as most of us are in one degree or another. Terrorist incidents and gun violence, corruption in government, politicians pandering to frightened people who seemed determined to be ignorant, and a few of whom are inclined to be violent. An entire school system in Virginia was closed down on Friday because of the threatening climate created by parents who objected, probably rightly, to a clumsy assignment given out by a teacher who should have done a little more research, which could have been settled so easily without threats. We had our own puzzling episode with diversity in schools here in Albuquerque this week. I guess we should all congratulate ourselves that nobody got violent and nobody will have to have a makeup day in the heat of summer because of it. But two other school systems in our nation had to decide whether or not to shut down to protect their students against violence and threats. Random gunshots killed a football player, injured a shopper in a mall last week. This is just awful. And climate change, even though we seem to be moving through our denial slowly and starting to get to work, brings the specter of looming disaster. And then there's the general climate of meanness which pervades politics and especially campaigns. I've talked to more people in the last couple of weeks who are feeling pessimistic about our society and our corporate future than I have in a long time. And I felt pretty down myself. It all seems pretty dark. Probably not as dark as the times felt during the Mexican or Civil Wars, but bad enough. The hopes and fears of all the years seem very close this holiday season. And besides, it's dark when I get up in the morning, and it's dark when I go home at night, and where is the light? It must have gotten swallowed by the dark side, don't you think, in preparation for the release of the Star Wars movie, Episode 7, for the first for a new generation of this epic galactic battle between the dark side and the Force. The dark side, with its stark white armored henchmen and its black helmeted leaders, has arisen again in a galaxy far away. 2 generations of good guys have already fought, and still evil abides. How many times do we have to do this? And so good and earnest and gifted young people have to leave the safety and home they know and save their worlds and fight for good, for color, for humor, for love. That how many times resonates with me. Over and over again seems, really, over and over again, we seem to be tempted to violate our Constitution, to trash human rights, to break our own laws, to violate the tenets of our own faiths, which call us to love our neighbors and honor strangers, because we're scared, we say, and not even of things very likely to hurt us either. Over and over again, we fight ignorance, we long for leaders who can lead, for a little humanity in the public square, and for justice and equality and civility to prevail. A little progress gets made, it seems. There are a few weeks or months or years in which hope comes more naturally, and then we're at it again, slogging away with evil in the darkness. Once upon a time, I was young enough to be sanguine about the way the pendulum swings back and forth, but now I'm starting to wonder if my optimistic nature will see another swing. This is the darkest time of the year, but it's also the time of the year which abounds with stories which could bring us hope if we were willing. And the festive release of the Star Wars movie is only the most recent of all those holidays. In that movie, out of the ever-darkening, worrisome times, fresh youth and wise heads, all at least somewhat reluctantly, come together with their sometime enemies in a galaxy of diverse faces to confront the dark side. It's a smash hit all over the world. Who's seen it? You guys need to get out more. And those of you who saw it, did it recharge your hope? Yes. Okay. The makers of Star Wars from the beginning have leaned heavily into humanity's stories about the battle between light and darkness, and in a very nuanced way, which reminds us that we all have some of each within us, that we can change during our lives. The Star Wars universe is best represented by that Taoist yin-yang back here on our mural, the swirling forces of light and darkness which change, which contain each other, and which work in our lives in different ways. Here's the story in a nutshell. It gets darker and darker and darker, and the forces of good call us to sacrifice, to community, to work. Just let it in. Here's another one of those stories, a really old one. The oft-told Solstice story goes something like this, that the ancient peoples noticed that the sun was getting lower and lower in the sky and that the hours of light were fewer and fewer, and they were sore afraid because life needs light in a very direct and obvious way. And so they carefully marked the low point on the horizon and celebrated when they noticed that the sun was moving northward and higher in the sky again. That time is actually about the 25th of December, as a matter of fact, and no small part of the reason that the early church chose that date on which to celebrate Christmas, which by all internal biblical evidence happened in the spring. Shepherds abide in the field so that the lambs can be born, don't you know? It's actually unlikely that the ancients felt any anxiety about the sun's return to warmth. They'd been around a while, after all. And it is even possible that while they were surely glad of the warmth before central air, they also knew that the frozen meat would keep longer than it ever would in the merry month of May, that sleep is necessary, that dreams enrich us, and that rest from the frenzied work of summer is a good thing. Doesn't mean they didn't celebrate. Of course they did. Holly and ivy and fires to gather the community and songs and good food. The ancients marked the passage of the season because they valued the balance and the play of light and dark, which is the story of the solstice. It gets darker and darker and darker, and then light returns. Tomorrow's the solstice. Tonight, therefore, the longest night of the year. By this time next week, even an ordinary person in the city who's observant can notice a few more minutes of light in the day. I invite you to make a practice of noticing that this week, when the sun rises and sets, when the darkness falls. You'll see. And I suggest that you do that not only to get you outside, which is in itself a good antidote to despair, but so you remember when you hear the next round of bad news, misbehaving public servants, or even notice a little dark side in yourself, that this is how the world works. It gets darker and darker and darker, and then the light returns. Last week, Angela told us 3 stories that answer the question, why Hanukkah? Here's a 4th story. Hanukkah was a relatively minor holiday in Judaism until after the Holocaust. However the story was told, and whichever of the stories were told, they featured an ancient threat to the Jewish people and their way of life, a threat which was overcome, for a while, by guerrilla grit or by a miracle. And there's the bit about candles in the darkness, which certainly resonates in human hearts at this time of year, especially in Northern Europe, where so many Jewish communities lived in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So, a fancier than usual meal, a little spending money, and a special game for the children, and the story retold in the synagogue, a very minor holiday. Until World War II, when the Jewish European community was decimated by the Holocaust, by the actions and inactions of leaders in almost every nation in the West, including ours. American Jews, both venerable and new refugees of war, took notice. A genocide attempt on people of your blood is a wound that does not heal for generations. And so suddenly an obscure holiday that took notice of darkness, physical and heartfelt, in human life, took on new appeal in the Jewish community, and Hanukkah took off. It's commonly said that Hanukkah gained importance in the second half of the last century so that Jewish children could have an equivalent of Christmas. But that's not the whole story, It's probably not even the half of it. The whole story is that the Jewish community was shaken to its core by the Holocaust, and because of that, they resurrected an old story of resistance and the forces of help and hope. It gets darker and darker and darker, but we light one candle, and with that candle we light others, one at a time, until our light shines proud and true. We light candles of hope because we survived. We say never again, and we let time do its healing work. It gets darker and darker and darker, and we do what we can, small though that might be. Can the people of First Unitarian Church solve the problems of poverty and homelessness in our nation? No. But we can offer hospitality a few times a year to a few families caught in homelessness, to give them a breathing space to solve some of their problems and make new plans. That's what the Family Promise program is all about. You'll be hearing a lot about this because we'll be welcoming our first guests for a week's stay in only about 6 weeks. And there's a lot to do and some money to raise in the meantime. It's a light one candle solution. And we do it not only because every family helped is, after all, a family helped, but because one candle lights another, one at a time, until humanity and goodness prevail, at least here, at least for a time, over the powers of evil. Do you believe that? Well, remember it, even in hard times. Do you feel the calling? Just let it in. The Christian story of the child born in the manger fits the same pattern. In that grim and dark time, when things were uncertain, when a tyrant was in power, when the poor were being crushed and everyone feared civil unrest, the people of Bethlehem offered what hospitality they could muster to 2 strangers, and a child was born whose words would change the world. That's the story. It's repeated every night of the year, in every labor. It gets darker and darker and darker, and then a child is born, right? Right. Hope calls to us. Just let it in. In paganism, as in Christianity, a symbolic child is born at the darkest time of the year, a sun child who will bring the spring with her adolescence and die in the autumn with the harvest. Thus, Yule is the celebration of the circle of immortality and rebirth in nature. In the midst of the cold, dark, and seeming death, we celebrate birth, light, and warmth. The evergreens, the holly wreaths, the mistletoe, the ivy, which we use to decorate our homes, the lights we light, and the red and green that are the colors of the season, all make reference to those old themes. It's a paradox. Light in a time of darkness, greens in a time of snow, fire in a time of cold. Paradox is a part of life. We feel loneliness in times of celebration. We know we must rest for times of growth. We understand that growth comes often in the midst of pain. And that, too, is the message of the evergreens in winter and the candles lit in the early dark. Here's another paradox. Down as you might feel about the state of the world, depressing as it all might seem, frightening this climate of terrorism is, and prevail we must. And the weight of it all seems crushingly heavy. Where's the light? The light's inside of you. A tiny candle sheltered from the cold and wind by the life forces in your bodies. An infant of an idea or a strength or a longing of your heart growing inside. I can see it from here in each of your faces. Here's the light. Just let it in. Well, somebody's going to have to tell me what our last